The story does not begin with violence or fire, but with a quiet that feels almost unnatural. The earth already exists, shape-shaped and settled after ages of turmoil that have long since faded from view. Oceans stretch wide and uninterrupted, their surfaces moving in slow, rhythmic patterns beneath a dim, distant sun. Continents rest in unfamiliar positions, drifting so slowly that their motion cannot be seen, only imagined, across vast spans of time. The sky hangs above in soft gradients, neither hostile nor welcoming, simply present. At first glance, everything appears complete, and yet something feels missing. There are no steps pressing into the soil, no wings cutting through the air, no distant calls echoing across valleys or shorelines. The land lies open and still, untouched by movement. The oceans, though vast, reveal no obvious life from above, only shifting reflections of light. Even the wind, when it moves, seems to pass through an empty world, carrying nothing with it but silence. It is a planet that should feel alive, but instead feels paused, as though waiting for something that has not yet arrived. It is easy to imagine that life has not yet begun, that this is a world before existence truly takes hold. But that assumption would not be entirely true, because life is already here, hidden beneath the surface of the oceans, in waters that appear calm and unchanged. Countless microscopic organisms drift and gather. They are too small to be seen, too simple to be noticed, yet they exist in numbers beyond comprehension. They form thin layers along the seafloor, cling to mineral surfaces, and float invisibly through the currents. They do not move with intention, do not hunt, do not think, and yet they persist. Forms of life do not resemble anything familiar. There are no shapes to recognize, no behaviors to follow, no patterns that draw the eye. They leave no clear traces for imagination to grasp. If someone were to stand on this ancient earth and look out across its oceans, they would see nothing that suggests life is present at all. And still, beneath that illusion of emptiness, the planet is quietly active, long before animals, long before forests, long before anything that could be called complex. This world is already inhabited. But it is a kind of life that does not announce itself. It does not compete for attention. It does not transform the surface in ways that can be easily seen. Instead, it exists in a state of quiet persistence, shaping the world in ways that are almost impossible to detect. The Earth, at this moment, is not lifeless. It is simply unfamiliar. There is a strange contrast in this realization. A living planet that appears empty. A world filled with activity that feels completely still. It challenges expectation, gently but persistently, as the mind tries to reconcile what it sees with what is actually there. Because everything about this place suggests that something more should be happening. But nothing does. Not yet. The silence stretches across millions of years, unbroken and uninterrupted. The oceans continue their slow movements. The continents drift without urgency. The sky remains unchanged, and beneath it all, life continues its quiet work, unnoticed and unrecognized, as if preparing for something it cannot yet become. It is not the absence of life that defines this world. It is the absence of everything we expect life to be. And as that thought settles, another question begins to form, almost naturally, as if it has been waiting just beneath the surface all along. If the world already holds life, then what exactly is it doing? Beneath the calm surface of the ancient oceans, something vast is unfolding, though nothing about it can be seen from above. The water appears empty, stretching in slow, endless motion beneath a quiet sky. Yet within it exists a world so dense, so active, that it quietly shapes the fate of the entire planet. It is a world without forms that can be easily imagined, without movement that draws attention, without sound or signal to announce its presence. And still, it is everywhere. Countless microscopic organisms drift through these waters, suspended in currents that carry them across distances far greater than they could ever travel on their own. They gather in thin layers along the seafloor, forming delicate, living surfaces that spread across shallow regions where light can reach. In these places, vast microbial mats develop, stretching outward like silent landscapes beneath the water, growing slowly. layer by layer, over spans of time, too long to fully grasp. Nothing about them appears dramatic. There are no sudden movements, no visible struggles, no clear signs of interaction. And yet, within these microscopic communities, processes unfold that will quietly alter the entire world. These organisms do not rely on complexity. They do not need eyes, limbs, or even coordinated behavior. Instead, they exist through chemistry, through simple reactions that allow them to gather energy from their surroundings. Some draw energy from sunlight, capturing it in ways that slowly release oxygen into the water. Others rely on chemical gradients, surviving in environments that would seem completely inhospitable. Together, they form systems that are both simple and incredibly powerful. At first, the changes they create are almost impossible to notice. Oxygen released in small amounts dissolves into the oceans, reacting with minerals and disappearing almost as quickly as it forms. For long stretches of time, it leaves no clear trace in the atmosphere. The surface of the planet remains unchanged, still silent, still empty to the eye. But the process does not stop. Over millions of years, these invisible organisms continue their quiet work. Oxygen begins to accumulate, slowly overwhelming the chemical systems that once absorbed it. The oceans change, their composition shifting, in ways that would be impossible to detect without knowing what to look for. And eventually, something even more subtle begins to happen. The atmosphere itself starts to transform. This change is not sudden. There is no clear moment when the sky becomes different, no visible signal that something fundamental has shifted. And yet, with each passing age, the balance of gases above the planet moves further away from its original state. What was once rare begins to grow more common. What was once impossible begins to become inevitable. All of it driven by organisms that cannot be seen. It is easy to think of this era as simple, as uneventful, as a long stretch of time where nothing truly important. But that perception hides a deeper truth. This is not a period of inactivity. It is a period of construction. Every quiet reaction, every unseen exchange of energy contributes to a slow transformation that will make all future complexity possible. The world is being rewritten, not through sudden events, but through persistence. And perhaps the most unsettling realization is this: the dominant life forms of this world leave almost no trace for imagination to hold on to. There are no shapes to picture, no creatures to follow, no scenes to replay. The most important activity on the planet is happening in a way that feels almost invisible to human thought. An entire empire exists, ruling the earth without presence, without recognition, without ever being seen. It reshapes oceans, alters the sky, and prepares the conditions for everything that will come next. And yet, if someone were to stand on the surface during this time, they would still see nothing but quiet water, empty land, and a sky that reveals no hint of the transformation below. But the balance is shifting, slowly, almost imperceptibly. The work of these unseen organisms begins to reach a threshold, one that will not remain hidden forever. There is no sudden moment when the world appears different, no line drawn across time, where one could say, this is when everything changed. Instead, the transformation begins so quietly that it could be mistaken for nothing at all. Deep within the oceans, among those vast unseen communities of microscopic life, a simple process continues without interruption. Light touches the surface of the water, and certain organisms respond, capturing that energy and releasing something new into their surrounding. Oxygen. At first it does not seem important. It does not gather in visible clouds or alter the color of the sky. It dissolves into the ocean, reacting instantly with iron and other elements, disappearing as quickly as it forms. For a long time it leaves no lasting trace, as though the planet itself is quietly absorbing it, keeping it hidden from view. But the process does not stop. Again and again, across millions of years, oxygen is released. Slowly, the systems that once consumed it begin to fill. The oceans can no longer absorb it as easily. The balance begins to shift, though nothing on the surface reflects this change. The water still moves as it always has. The continents remain silent. The sky gives no clear sign that anything unusual is happening, and yet something irreversible has begun. For many of the organisms that already exist, oxygen is not a gift. It is a threat. Their biology, shaped in a world without it, cannot tolerate its presence. As levels rise, environments that once supported life begin to change in ways that are no longer survivable. Populations decline, ecosystems collapse, and entire forms of life fade away. It is one of the earliest great extinctions, but it happens without spectacle. There are no visible catastrophes, no sudden destruction. The world remains calm, even as life within it struggles to adapt or disappears entirely. From the surface, nothing appears different. The silence continues, uninterrupted. This is the paradox. A world that looks unchanged is undergoing one of the most profound transformations in its history. A gas that cannot be seen is quietly rewriting the rules of existence. What once sustained life is now being replaced by something new, something more reactive, more powerful, and far more dangerous. And yet, within that danger lies possibility, because oxygen does not only destroy, it also creates as it accumulates. It begins to open pathways that were previously impossible. It allows for new forms of energy use, new chemical reactions, new structures that can sustain greater complexity. It reshapes the atmosphere, forming layers that will one day protect the surface from harmful deation. It prepares the planet for something it has never supported before, but that future is still far away. For now, the change remains slow, almost imperceptible. Millions of years pass, and the transformation continues without interruption. The oxygen builds, molecule by molecule, until it becomes an undeniable part of the environment. The world is no longer what it once was, even if it still looks the same. It is easy to imagine change as something sudden, something visible and immediate. But here it unfolds in silence, across spans of time so vast that no single moment can capture it. There is no single turning point, no clear beginning or end. Only a gradual shift that moves the planet towards something new, something more. And yet, even as all of this takes place, something unexpected remains. Complex life does not appear. The oceans, though transformed in their chemistry, remain dominated by simplicity. The land stays empty. The sky, now altered in composition, watches over a world that still feels incomplete. The conditions seem ready, the foundation prepared, and yet nothing rises to meet that potential. It is as though the planet has taken a step forward and then paused, waiting once again in a silence that now feels deeper than before, because the question has changed. If the world is ready for complexity, why does it not arrive? By now, everything seems ready. The oceans have changed, their chemistry altered by the slow rise of oxygen. The atmosphere, once hostile in ways difficult to imagine, has begun to take on a new balance. The invisible work of countless microscopic organisms has reshaped the planet, preparing it for something more. If there were ever a moment for complexity to emerge, it would seem to be here. And yet it does not. Time continues to move forward, but the world does not follow in the way one might expect. The oceans remain filled with life, but that life stays simple, small, and largely unchanged. The land, though now touched by shifting air and subtle chemical processes, remains empty and silent. The sky stretches above a planet that feels as though it is holding its breath. Years pass, then millions, then hundreds of millions. Still, nothing new appears. It is in this long stretch of time that something unusual begins to take shape. Not in the world itself, but in the way it is understood. From a distance, looking back across this immense span, it might be tempting to call it uneventful. A quiet interval between more dramatic chapters, a pause in the story, but the longer one lingers within it, the more unsettling it becomes. Because this is not a brief delay, it is nearly 1 billion years, an expanse of time so vast that it defies normal understanding. Entire mountain ranges rise and wear away within it. Continents drift across the globe, colliding, separating, and reshaping the face of the planet again and again. The oceans shift, climates adjust, and still, life remains much the same, simple, persistent, unchanged in any visible way. This is the paradox that begins to take hold. The conditions that once seemed impossible for complexity have now been met. Oxygen exists. Energy is available. The building blocks are present, and yet life does not take the next step. It simply continues. At first, it may seem like nothing more than patience, as though evolution is moving at its own pace, slowly preparing for what will come next. But as the time stretches further and further, that explanation begins to feel incomplete. Because this is not a moment of waiting. It is an era. Within the oceans, microbial life continues its quiet processes, forming vast but invisible ecosystems. They adapt in small ways, refine their chemistry, and persist through changing conditions. But they do not become larger. They do not organize into complex structures. They do not transform the world in any way that can be easily seen. It is as if something is holding them in place, not stopping them entirely, but preventing them from moving forward. The planet itself does not appear hostile. There are no global catastrophes, wiping out progress as soon as it begins. There are no obvious barriers that can be pointed to and instead, there is only a subtle sense that something is missing, something just out of reach, a condition not yet met, a balance not yet achieved. And so, life continues in its simplest form, repeating patterns that have already existed for hundreds of millions of years. Generation after generation passes, each one similar to the last, each one part of a system that feels stable, almost too stable, because stability, in its own way, can become a kind of barrier. When nothing pushes change, nothing demands adaptation, nothing forces life to move beyond what it already is, then progress can slow to a near standstill. Not because it cannot happen, but because there is no urgency for it to occur. The world, for all its quiet transformations, may have become too comfortable, and comfort does not always lead to innovation. This is the deeper mystery that begins to emerge. Not why life failed, but why it did not try. Why, in a world that seemed ready, complexity remained just out of reach for so long. There are hints, small clues scattered across this vast stretch of time. Subtle changes in ocean chemistry variations in nutrient availability, shifts in environmental stability that may have quietly limited what life could become, but none of them offer a complete answer. The truth remains uncertain, and that uncertainty lingers, stretching across the silence, like a question that refuses to resolve. Because for nearly 1 billion years life does not advance in the way one might expect. It endures. It persists. It continues its quiet existence beneath the surface of a world that appears unchanged. And the longer this continues, the more the question deepens. If everything was ready, then what was missing? The silence of this long age does not come from absence. It comes from limitation. From the outside, the world appears ready. Oxygen exists, the oceans are stable, and life continues without interruption. There are no obvious disasters halting progress, no visible forces pushing life backward, and yet something prevents it from moving forward. The question is no longer whether life can become complex, but whether it is being allowed to, because complexity is not simply a matter of time. It is a matter of conditions. To grow beyond simplicity, life requires more than survival. It needs energy in abundance, not just enough to persist, but enough to build, to experiment, to sustain larger and more demanding forms. It needs environments that are not only stable, but dynamic enough to encourage change. It needs variation, pressure, competition, forces that push organisms beyond what they already are. And during this long stretch of Earth's history, many of those elements remain just out of reach. The oceans, though vast and full of life, may have been quietly limited in ways that are not immediately obvious. Essential nutrients, scattered and unevenly distributed, could have restricted growth, keeping organisms small and simple. Without enough of these building materials, even the potential for complexity would remain locked away, unable to fully emerge. Energy, too, may have been constrained. Oxygen was rising, but not yet at levels that could support the high demands of larger, more intricate forms of life. What existed was enough for survival, but perhaps not enough for expansion. And then there is the matter of pressure. For evolution to move forward, there must be a reason to change, challenge to over-competition to win, a threat to escape. But in a world dominated by simple life, where ecosystems remain relatively, without predators, without rapid environmental shifts, without intense competition, there is little to force innovation. Life continues, but it does not transform. It refines what already exists, perfecting simplicity, rather than moving beyond it. Even at the cellular level, there may have been boundaries that could not easily be crossed. Early cells, though capable of survival, lacked the internal complexity needed to support larger structures. Without new ways to organize energy and information, they remained confined within a certain range of possibilities. It is not that life was incapable, it is that the path forward was blocked by conditions that were almost, but not quite, right. These barriers are not visible. They leave no clear mark on the surface of the planet. There are no walls to point to, no boundaries that can be easily defined. And yet they exist, surrounding life in ways that shape its limits without ever revealing themselves. It is a quiet kind of constraint, one that does not stop progress entirely, but slows it to a near standstill. And this is where the deeper realization begins to take hold. Complexity is not inevitable. It is not a guaranteed outcome of time or existence. It is something that depends on a precise balance of factors, each one needing to align in just the right way. Without that alignment, life can continue indefinitely in its simplest form, stable but unchanged. For hundreds of millions of years, this balance remains incomplete. The world is close, but not close enough. And so, the silence continues, not because nothing is happening, but because everything that is happening remains within invisible limits. Limits that are slowly, almost imperceptibly, beginning to shift. Because even the most stable systems cannot remain afore. Subtle variations begin to appear. Small changes in environment, in chemistry, in the interactions between organisms. At first they seem insignificant, barely noticeable against the vast background of time. But they are there. And with them comes the faintest hint that something new is beginning to form. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but quietly, as it always has. A change so small it could be missed. And yet one that may finally begin to loosen the barriers that have held life in place for so long. The change does not arrive with a signal. There is no sudden shift in the oceans, no visible transformation across the surface of the planet. The same quiet patterns continue, the same microscopic life drifting and settling as it has for hundreds of millions of years. If anything, the world appears unchanged, still wrapped in that long, unbroken silence. And yet, beneath that stillness, something begins to move in a new direction. It starts in a way so subtle that it could easily be overlooked. Certain cells, processes begin to take on a different form. Instead of existing as simple, self-contained units, some begin to hold structures within them, small, internal systems that allow them to manage energy more efficiently, to organize their functions in ways that were not possible before. At first, this does not seem significant. These cells do not grow large. They do not form visible shapes. They do not alter the landscape or disrupt the calm of the oceans. But what is happening inside them represents a quiet shift in possibility. Because for the first time, life is beginning to carry complexity within itself. This is not a transformation that spreads quickly. It does not sweep across the planet or replace what already exists. Instead, it appears in isolated moments, in small populations, as if the world is testing a new idea without fully committing to it. Some cells begin to merge with others, not as competitors, but as partners. One cell enters another and remains, not as a threat, but as a source of energy. Over time, this relationship stabilizes, becoming permanent. What was once two separate organisms becomes one, functioning together in a way that neither could achieve alone. It is a quiet act of cooperation, and it changes everything, because this new structure allows for greater efficiency, greater flexibility, and the potential for growth beyond previous limits. These cells, now more complex internally, can begin to explore new ways of existing. They are no longer bound entirely by the constraints that held earlier life in place. But still, the world does not notice. The oceans remain calm. The surface shows no sign of what is unfolding below, even among life itself. This change is not dominant. It exists alongside simplicity, not yet replacing it, not yet defining the direction of the planet. It is only a beginning. And beginnings, especially those that matter most, are often quiet. Time continues to pass, and these new forms persist. They do not disappear as other experiments have before. Instead, they hold their structure, refine it, and slowly expand their presence. Not rapidly, not dramatically, but steadily, a whisper of something more. The difference is almost impossible to see in any single moment. There is no clear boundary between what was and what will be, only a gradual shift, where the potential for complexity begins to take shape within the smallest units of life. And with that potential comes something new. Not yet movement, as we understand it, not yet awareness, not yet interaction, in the ways that will later define the living world. But the foundation is there, quietly forming, waiting to be built upon. The long silence has not ended. But it has changed because now, within that silence, there is direction, a sense that life is no longer simply maintaining itself, but beginning to move towards something it has never been before. The barriers that once held it in place are no longer absolute. They are beginning to loosen, to shift, to allow new possibilities to emerge. And though the world above remains still, unchanged to the eye, the path forward has finally begun to open. Not with a sudden step, but with a movement so small it could almost be missed, a whisper carried across time. And once that whisper begins, it cannot be taken back, because the silence, after so long, is finally starting to break, and what follows will not be quiet. The change does not arrive as a conflict. There is no struggle that reshapes the world, no Henkist for dominance, no hodden Rasav of stronger forms pushing weaker ones aside. The oceans remain calm, their surface unchanged, their depths still filled with the same quieting life. And yet something profound begins to unfold within that stillness, not through competition, but through cooperation. For billions of years, life has existed as separate units, each cell enclosed within its own BUF. Every organism lives and dies as an individual, shaped by its ability to endure the conditions around it. This has been the rule, repeated endlessly across time, until, slowly, that rule begins to bend. Some cells do something unexpected. Instead of resisting one another, instead of remaining separate, they begin to come together. One cell enters another, not as an attack, not as a threat, but as something quieter, something more uncertain. At first, it could have gone either way. The invading cell might have been consumed, broken down, used as energy like so many interactions before it. But in certain rare moments, something different happens. The host cell does not destroy it, and the internal cell does not harm its host. They remain side by side within the same boundary. At first, this arrangement is fragile. It is not yet a system, not yet a reliable structure. It is simply a possibility, an experiment that may or may not continue. But in some cases, it does continue. The internal cell begins to provide something useful, processing energy more efficiently, offering its host a small advantage. And in return, it receives protection, a stable environment, a place to exist without the constant pressure of the outside world. What begins as a temporary coexistence slowly becomes something more permanent. The relationship stabilizes, deepens, and over time transforms into something entirely new. Two separate lives become one. This is not a visible revolution. Nothing about the oceans changes. No new forms appear on the surface. No sudden movement signals that something has shifted. And yet, within the smallest units of life, a new kind of structure is forming, one that allows for greater complexity than ever before. Because now, life is no longer limited to what a single cell can do alone. It can combine. It can specialize. It can build internal systems that work together. each part supporting the whole. The internal cell, once independent, becomes something else entirely. It loses its autonomy, its separate identity, and takes on a new role within its host. It becomes a constant source of energy, a dedicated function within a larger system. Over time, it is no longer recognized as a separate organism at all. It becomes part of the cell itself, a structure, a function, something that future life will carry forward without ever knowing it was once its own living thing. This quiet merging marks a turning point that cannot be reversed. It introduces a new way for life to exist, one that is not based solely on independence, but on integration. Complexity begins to build, not by adding more of the same, but by combining different elements into a unified whole. And yet the world remains unaware. The oceans continue their slow rhythms. The surface reveals nothing. Even as this new form of life spreads, it does so quietly, without disruption, without drawing attention. But the implications are immense, because every complex organism that will ever exist carries this moment within it. Every structure, every system, every function that depends on coordinated activity traces back to this quiet decision, this shift from separation to cooperation. It is easy to imagine evolution as a process driven by struggle, by survival of the strongest, by constant competition. And in many ways that is true. But here, at the foundation of complexity, something else takes place. A different kind of strength emerges, one that is not based on dominance but on connection. And as these new cells continue to evolve, growing more intricate, more capable, a new possibility begins to take shape, not just within individual cells, but beyond them. Because if life can work together within itself, then perhaps it can begin to do the same on a larger scale. The shift from within begins to reach outward. Cells that have already learned to carry complexity inside themselves now encounter a new possibility, one that does not remain confined within a single boulder. It does not emerge all at once, and it does not follow a clear path. Instead, it begins as something tentative, almost uncertain, as if life itself is testing an idea it does not yet fully understand. In the shallow waters where light filters gently through the surface, certain cells begin to stay close to one another after dividing. Instead of separating completely, they remain attached, forming small clusters that drift together through the currents. At first, this attachment seems insignificant, a minor variation in behavior that could easily disappear. And often it does. These early groups are fragile. They form, then break apart. They gather, then dissolve back into individual units. The ocean continues its quiet motion, carrying them apart as easily as it brings them together. There is no stability, no permanence, no clear advantage that ensures their survival. It is simply an experiment. And like many experiments, most of them fail. For long stretches of time, these clusters appear and disappear without leaving a lasting mark. Life continues much as it always has, dominated by individual cells moving through their environment alone. The idea of togetherness exists, but it is not yet strong enough to take hold. Still, it does not AAT. Again and again, in different places under slightly different conditions, the same pattern begins to reappear. Cells remain connected. Small groups form. Some attach to surfaces, growing in place while others drift as loose assemblies, maintaining a fragile cohesion for longer than before. There is no guiding force behind this change, no direction, no plan, only repetition, trial after trial across millions of years. And within that repetition, something begins to shift. Some of these clusters last just a little longer. They hold together through gentle currents that would have separated them before. They grow slightly larger, not through a single cell expanding, but through many cells remaining connected, sharing space, sharing resources. It is not yet cooperation in the way it will later become. The cells do not communicate in complex ways, do not coordinate their actions with intention, but there is a subtle benefit in their closeness. Together they are more stable. Together they can endure conditions that might disrupt a single cell alone. And slowly, that small advantage begins to matter. The ocean remains unchanged to the eye. No new forms rise above the surface. No visible creatures move through the water. And yet, beneath that calm exterior, these quiet experiments continue, growing slightly more persistent with each passing age. It would be easy to overlook them, to see only the simplicity of life, and assume that nothing new is taking place. But within these fragile clusters lies the beginning of something entirely different. A new way of existing, where individuality does not disappear, but becomes part of something larger, not yet a single organism, not yet a unified form, but something in between. The uncertainty remains. Many of these groups still break apart. Many still fail to last. There is no guarantee that this path will succeed, no certainty that life will continue in this direction. For a long time, it remains just one possibility among many, but it is a possibility that does not fade. And as it persists, as these clusters begin to hold together just a little longer, to resist separation just a little more, a quiet question begins to form within the unfolding story of life. What happens if they do not break apart? What happens if instead of returning to individuality, they remain together? Because if that happens, even once, even briefly, it would mark the beginning of something the world has never seen before, a form of life that is no longer alone. And as that possibility lingers, barely visible, but impossible to ignore, the path forward begins to open in a new and unexpected way. The clusters do not break apart. Not all of them, not anymore. Some remain together long enough for something new to take shape. What was once a temporary gathering begins to hold, to stabilize, to persist beyond the moment that created it. Cells that once drifted freely now stay connected, forming structures that endure through time instead of dissolving back into separation. And for the first time, life begins to have a shape. It is not a shape that moves or hunts or reacts in ways that can be easily understood. It does not rise from the water or spread across the land. It exists quietly, often anchored to surfaces beneath the ocean, or drifting slowly as a single unified form. But it holds its structure. It occupies space in a way that can no longer be ignored. These are not individuals in the way life once was. They are something else. Collections of cells that function together, maintaining a shared form, growing not as separate units, but as a whole. Their boundaries are no longer defined by a single membrane, but by the collective presence of many cells working in quiet coordination. They do not act with intention. They do not respond quickly to their surroundings. They do not chase or flee or seek. And yet, they exist as bodies simple, soft, often fragile in appearance. These early forms rest within the ancient oceans, like silent figures in a world that has never known movement. Some resemble thin layers spreading across surfaces. Others rise slightly above the seafloor, forming rounded or elonite shapes that remain fixed in place. They do not change the landscape dramatically. They do not disturb the calm of the water, but their presence introduces something entirely new. For the first time, life is visible in a different way, not as something hidden within the water, not as an invisible force shaping the planet from below, but as a physical presence that occupies space, that can be imagined, that can be seen, if one were there to observe it. And yet there is something unusual about them. They exist without urgency. There is no sense of action within these forms, no sign that they are aware of their surroundings, no indication that they can respond to change in any meaningful way. They grow, they persist, and eventually they fade, replaced by others that follow the same quiet pattern. It is as if life has learned how to build a body, but not yet how to use it. This is the strange order of things. Complexity arrives, but not in the way one might expect. There is no sudden burst of activity, no immediate leap into movement or interaction. Instead, the structure comes first, the form, the presence. Only later will come the motion. Time continues to pass, and these early bodies remain part of the ocean's quiet landscape. They do not dominate, but they do not disappear either. They persist, holding their place within the evolving world, marking a transition that cannot be undone. Because once life learns how to exist as more than a single cell, once it begins to build structures that last, the possibilities begin to expand. Even if those possibilities are not yet realized, there is a subtle tension now. Something just beneath the calm. The world still appears slow, still feels quiet, but there is a sense that something is building, something that has not yet fully emerged. These bodies, though still and unresponsive, represent a threshold, a beginning. They are the first attempt at presence, the first indication that life can become more than it has been. And while they do not move, do not act, do not yet engage with the world around them, they create the conditions for what will follow. Because once a body exists, even a simple one, the next question becomes unavoidable. What can it do? And as that question lingers, carried quietly through the passing ages, the stillness of the world begins to feel different. Not empty, not paused, but waiting for the moment when these silent forms begin to respond, to move, to interact with the world that has followed them for so long. A moment that, once it arrives, will change everything that follows. The world does not transform all at once. There is no single moment when the oceans shift, no clear line where the past ends and something new begins. Instead, the changes arrive gradually, layered over time, subtle enough to be missed if one were only looking for something certain. And yet, taken together, they begin to reshape the planet in ways that can no longer be ignored. The air above grows different. Oxygen, once a rare and almost hidden presence, continues its quiet. It gathers not in bursts, but in slow accumulation, spreading across the atmosphere until it becomes a defining part of the world itself. What was once dangerous begins to settle into balance, no longer just a force of disruption, but a new condition that life must live within. The oceans, too, begin to shift. Their chemistry changes in response to this growing presence, altering the way elements move and interact. Currents adjust, carrying nutrients differently, redistributing the building blocks that life depends on. Some regions become richer, more supportive. Others grow limited, forcing life to persist under conditions that are less forgiving than before. Nothing appears chaotic. The surface remains calm. The sky does not darken. The seas do not raise in. And yet beneath that calm, the stability that once defined this world begins to loosen. The planet is no longer simply maintaining itself. It is changing. Climates begin to fluctuate in ways that are subtle but significant. Temperatures shift across long spans of time. Ice forms and retreats. Land masses continue their slow movement, altering coastlines, reshaping shallow seas, and creating new environments where none existed before. Each change on its own seems small, but together they begin to create something new, a world that is no longer entirely predictable. For life, this introduces a new kind of reality. Until now, existence has been defined by persistence within stable conditions. The oceans, though vast, have remained relatively consistent. The environment has allowed life to continue, to refine itself, to grow slowly without being forced into rapid change. But now, that quiet stability begins to shift, and with it comes pressure. Not immediate, not overwhelming, but present in a way it has not been before. Conditions vary. Resources become uneven. Some environments support growth while others begin to challenge it. The balance that once held everything in place becomes more dynamic, less certain. Life can no longer rely on sameness. It must begin to respond. This is the turning point that does not announce itself. The world is still quiet, still far from the complexity that will come later, but something fundamental has changed in the relationship between life and its surroundings. The planet is no longer simply a stage. It is becoming an active force, a system that shapes, pressures, and influences the direction of life itself. And this pressure, though subtle, carries with it a new possibility. Because where there is challenge, there is also opportunity. Environments that shift create openings. New conditions allow new forms to emerge, new strategies to develop, new ways of existing to take hold. What was once impossible may now begin to appear, not because life has suddenly changed, but because the world around it no longer remains the same. This is how transformation begins. Not through sudden events, but through gradual changes that alter the path forward, one small step at a time. The silence of the planet remains, but it feels different now, less like stillness, more like tension, because beneath the calm surface, the world is beginning to push life in ways it never has before. And life, for the first time, is being asked to do more than simply est. It is being asked to adapt, to respond, to change in ways it has never needed to before. And as these pressures continue to build, slowly but steadily, something new begins to take shape within the living world. Not yet visible, not yet fully formed, but present, a shift in behavior, in structure, in possibility. Because once the environment begins to demand a response, life cannot remain the same. It must begin to sense what surrounds it. And that is where the next transformation begins. The world is no longer something life simply exists within. It becomes something life begins to notice. Not in the way we understand noticing, not with thought or awareness, but through something far more subtle. A shift begins at the smallest level, within cells that once remained passive, unchanged by what surrounded them. Now, under the growing pressures of a changing planet, that passivity begins to fade. Life starts to respond. At first, the responses are simple. Light reaches the surface of the oceans, and certain cells react, adjusting their position slightly, drifting toward or away from its presence. Chemicals dissolve into the water, and some organisms shift in response, moving along invisible gradients that guide them toward what sustains them and away from what does not. There is no intention behind these movements, no decision, only reaction. And yet, that reaction changes everything because, for the first time, life is no longer entirely at the mercy of its environment. It begins, in the smallest possible way, to interact with it. A faint difference emerges between what happens to life and what life does in return. These early responses are not coordinated. They do not involve systems or structures that resemble what we would later recognize as senses. There are no eyes to see, no nerves to transmit information, no brain to interpret signals. But there is a beginning, a connection between the external world and the internal state of a living organism. Light, once just a constant presence, now influences behavior. Chemicals, once part of a passive environment, become signals that guide movement. Even slight changes in temperature or pressure begin to trigger subtle adjustments, shaping how organisms exist within their surroundings. The world is no longer neutral. It becomes meaningful, not in a conscious way, but in a functional one. Certain conditions lead to survival, while others lead to decline. And over time, these tiny responses begin to refine themselves, becoming more consistent, more reliable, more deeply integrated into the way life operates. What was once random becomes directional. What was once passive becomes active. The change is still quiet. The oceans do not stir with visible motion. The surface remains calm, the land still empty. But beneath that stillness, the nature of life itself is beginning to shift, because response leads to advantage. An organism that can adjust even slightly is more likely to endure. One that can move toward energy, however slowly, gathers more than one that remains in place. One that avoids harmful conditions, even in the simplest way, continues where others cannot. These differences are small at first, almost impossible to notice in a single moment, but across time they begin to matter. Life starts to carry within it the beginnings of behavior, not learnt, not chosen, but built into its very structure, a pattern of interaction between organism and environment that grows more defined with each passing generation. The separation between the two becomes less absolute, more connected, more intertwined. And within that connection lies something profound, the earliest foundation of what will well one day become perception. It is difficult to recognize at this stage. There is no awareness, no experience, no inner world as we understand it. But the basic principle is there, the ability to receive information from the surroundings and act upon it. A signal, a response, nothing more, and yet everything begins here because once life can respond, even in the simplest way, it is no longer entirely. It is no longer simply shaped by the world around it. It begins, in a small but meaningful sense, to shape its own path within that world. And as these responses grow more refined, more integrated, something new begins to follow. Movement, not yet widespread, not yet defining, but emerging from the same processes that allow life to sense and react. The ability to respond begins to extend beyond internal adjustments, reaching outward into physical action. A shift from stillness to motion. It does not happen all at once. It does not spread across the entire living world, but it begins quietly, as all things have. Because once life can sense the world, even in the simplest way, it becomes only a matter of time before it begins to move within it. At first, it is almost impossible to see. The oceans still appear calm, their surfaces unchanged, their depths filled with the same quiet presence that has defined them for so long. The early bodies that formed remain where they are, anchored or drifting slowly, existing without urgency. And yet, within that stillness, something begins to shift. A movement, not sudden, not dramatic, but real. Some of these simple organisms, shaped by the growing ability to respond to their environment, begin to do more than adjust internally. They begin to change their position. A slight contraction of their form, a gentle extension, a slow glide across a surface or through the water. It is not fast. It is not coordinated in the way movement will later become, but it is movement all the same. For the first time, life is no longer entirely fixed. The change is subtle, almost delicate. These organisms do not travel far. They do not chase or flee in any recognizable way, but they shift, guided by the faint signals they can now detect, light chemicals, gradients within the water that hint at where resources may be found. A small adjustment, a slow drift in a chosen direction, and with that, something entirely new enters the story. Because movement, even in its simplest forms, changes the relationship between life and the world around it. An organism that can move is no longer limited to the exact place where it exists. It can seek, it can avoid, it can respond not just by changing internally, but by changing where it is. The world becomes navigable. Before this moment, life endured its environment. It adapted slowly, over generations, to conditions it could not escape. But now, even if only slightly, it can act within those conditions. It can shift toward what supports it and away from what does not. The difference is small, but its implications are vast. Because within movement lies the earliest form of choice. Not conscious, not deliberate, but functional. A direction taken instead of another. A position selected through response rather than chance. It is not awareness, but it is the beginning of agency. The ability to influence one's own existence. However simply, the oceans do not erupt into activity. The world does not suddenly fill with motion. Most life remains still, unchanged by this new possibility. But some begin to carry it forward, refining the ability, becoming slightly more effective, slightly more responsive, slightly more capable with each passing age. And as they do, the nature of life continues to shift. Movement allows interaction with the environment in ways that were never possible before. Surfaces that once remained untouched can now be explored. Resources that were once unreachable can now be accessed. Conditions that would have been endured can now be avoided. The world, once something life existed within, becomes something life begins to move through. And though the scale is still small, the pace still slow, the direction is clear. Something has changed. The stillness that defined the ancient world is no longer complete. It has been broken, not by force, but by motion, by the quiet ability of life to shift itself through space, to act rather than simply remain. It is a turning point that does not announce itself, but cannot be undone. Because once movement begins, it does not stop. It spreads, evolves, refines, becoming more complex, more controlled, more purposeful over time. And with it comes new possibilities, new interactions, new pressures that will shape the future in ways that are still impossible to see. For now, the oceans remain calm, but within them, life has taken its first step into motion. And that step, however small, begins to change everything. Because once life can move, it will inevitably encounter something it has never truly faced before. Other life, moving too. At first, Movement only changes the relationship between life and its environment. An organism shifts toward light, drifts along a chemical gradient, settles where conditions feel more favorable. The world becomes something to navigate, something to respond to, something that can be approached or avoided. But this change, though profound, is only the beginning. Because the moment life begins to move, it does not move alone. In the vastness of the ancient oceans, countless organisms now drift, glide, and settle within the same spaces. Paths begin to cross, movements overlap. What was once a world of isolated existence becomes something more connected, more crowded, more uncertain. And with that closeness, something new emerges, interaction. At first it is subtle. Two organisms come into contact, their boundaries brushing against one another. There is no recognition, no awareness of what has happened. But the contact matters. It introduces a new variable into the quiet patterns of life, another living form occupying the same space, influencing the same environment. Some of these interactions remain neutral. Organisms pass by one another without consequence, continuing on their separate paths. But others begin to carry meaning. Competition begins to form, not as a deliberate struggle, but as a quiet overlap of needs. Multiple organisms draw from the same limited resources, light, nutrients, space. Where one thrives, another may be left with less. Where conditions favour one form, others begin to fade. There is no intention behind it, no awareness of conflict, but the effect is real. Life begins to influence life, and in that influence, the first hints of a system begin to take shape. At the same time, cooperation, once limited to what occurred within a single cell, begins to extend outward. Some organisms benefit from the presence of others, even if only indirectly. One produces substances that another can use. One alters the environment in a way that makes it more suitable for another to survive. The survive relationships are not planned. They are not stable, not yet, but they exist and they begin to repeat. And then something even more significant begins to occur. Some organisms do more than simply exist alongside others. They consume them. The first forms of predation emerge not as dramatic hunts, but as simple interactions where one organism absorbs or breaks down another for energy. It is not yet a chase, not yet a pursuit through space. It is a direct encounter, a moment where one life form becomes the resource of another. The balance shifts again, because now survival is no longer only about enduring the environment. It is about existing among other living things. This introduces a new kind of pressure, one that has not existed before. An organism must not only find resources, but also avoid becoming one. It must not only survive conditions, but navigate a world where other forms of life influence its chances of continuing. The oceans, once defined by quiet persistence, begin to feel different. Not chaotic, but active. A network begins to form, invisible yet powerful, where each organism is connected to others through shared resources, indirect effects, and direct interactions. The world is no longer a collection of separate lives, but a web of relationships that shape how each part exists. And within that web, change accelerates, because interaction creates feedback. It introduces variation, pressure, and opportunity all at once. A small advantage in one organism can ripple outward, influencing others. A new way of surviving can alter the balance of an entire environment. Complexity no longer grows only from within. It grows between organisms, between relationships, between the countless interactions that now define the living world. This is the moment when life stops being alone. Not in the sense of numbers. It has never been alone, but in the sense of connection. Every organism now exists within a system, shaped not only by the world around it, but by the presence of others like it. The change is quiet, as it always has been, but it is undeniable. Because once life begins to interact, it can never return to isolation. And as these interactions deepen, becoming more frequent, more significant, new pressures begin to emerge. Pressures that will push life beyond anything it has yet achieved, toward forms that are more complex, more capable, and far less predictable. The world does not become violent, not in the way one might imagine. There are no sudden battles, no dramatic chases, no visible struggle that transforms the oceans into chaos. The surface remains calm, the movement slow, the rhythm steady, and yet, beneath that quiet exterior, something begins to change in the way life exists. Survival is no longer certain. For billions of years, life persisted within a world that demanded endurance, but offered relative stability. Organisms adapted slowly, shaped by their environment, but rarely forced into immediate change. But now, with the rise of interaction, that balance begins to shift. Life must begin to respond not only to the world, but to each other. And with that, new strategies begin to appear. At first, they are subtle. Some organisms grow slightly larger, not dramatically, but enough to make a difference. A larger size allows them to absorb more energy, to endure longer, to become less vulnerable to being consumed by others. It is not a perfect solution, but it offers an advantage. Others begin to change their outer structure. Their surfaces, once simple and exposed, develop variations, thicker layers, protective coverings, forms that make them more difficult to break down. These changes are not yet what we would recognize as shells or armor, but they represent the earliest attempts at protection. And then there are those that refine their ability to consume. They become more efficient, more capable of breaking down other organisms, of extracting energy more effectively. What was once a simple interaction begins to develop into something more directed, more consistent. The act of feeding becomes a strategy in itself. None of these changes appear all at once. They emerge gradually, scattered across different forms of life, each one a response to the growing complexity of the world. There is no single direction, no unified path forward, only variation, experimentation. Some of these strategies work, others do not. Many forms of life attempt changes that offer no advantage, fading away without leaving a lasting mark. But a few persist. A few provide just enough benefit to continue, to spread, to influence what comes next. And slowly, the balance of the living world begins to shift. The oceans, once defined by quiet coexistence, now carry a subtle tension. Not a visible conflict, but a sense that existence has become more demanding. Resources are no longer simply found. They must be reached. Safety is no longer assumed, it must be maintained. Life is no longer just present. It is engaged. This engagement does not disrupt the calm of the world, but it changes its nature. Every organism now exists within a system where its survival depends, not only on conditions, but on its ability to respond to those conditions in ways that others cannot. A slight advantage becomes meaningful. A small adaptation becomes significant, and over time, these differences begin to shape the direction of life itself. There is no fairness in this process, no guarantee that all forms will continue. Some will fail, unable to adapt to the new pressures. Others will succeed, not because they are stronger in any absolute sense, but because they are better suited to the changing world around them. This is the quiet beginning of competition. Not loud, not immediate, but real. For the first time, life must earn its place. The stillness that once defined existence has given way to something more active, more uncertain. The peaceful persistence of earlier ages begins to feel distant, replaced by a world where survival, adaptation, change, on the ability, on the ability to meet challenges that did not exist before. And yet, even now, the transformation remains incomplete. The strategies are still simple. The forms still limited. The pace still slow. But the direction is clear. Because once life begins to compete, once it develops ways to survive beyond simple endurance, it moves towards something greater, toward diversity, toward complexity, toward a threshold that's been building for billions of years. And as that threshold approaches, the quiet world begins to feel as though it is holding something back. As if all these small changes, all these subtle strategies, are leading toward a moment that has not yet arrived. Poon will. There comes a moment in long stories where everything feels as though it has gathered in one place, not in a single instant, not in a singular event, but in a quiet accumulation of change that stretches back further than memory can follow. The world, after billions of years of slow transformation, begins to feel different, not visibly, not yet, but in a way that lingers beneath the surface, like a tension that has been building for longer than anything has ever endured. All the pieces are now here. The oceans carry oxygen in ways they never once did. The atmosphere above has shifted into something new, something that allows for possibilities that did not exist before. Cells have learned to hold complexity within themselves, to merge, to cooperate, to build structures that can sustain more than simple survival. Life can move, it can respond, it can interact, and most importantly, it can adapt. Each of these changes taken alone might seem small. A slight increase in oxygen, a subtle shift in cellular structure, a quiet emergence of movement or interaction. But together they form something far more significant. A foundation, one that's taken billions of years to build. And yet for all this preparation, the world still feels restrained. The oceans remain calm. The land is still empty. The sky watches over a planet that, despite everything it has become, still holds back from what it could be. Life continues, more capable than ever before, but not yet fully expressed. It is as though something is waiting, not for time, but for alignment. Because complexity does not emerge simply because it can. It emerges when conditions allow it to move forward without resistance. When the barriers that once held it in place have finally weakened enough to let something new pass through. And now, those barriers are fading. The pressures that once limited growth have shifted. Nutrients circulate more freely. Oxygen supports new forms of energy use. Interactions between organisms create forces that push life beyond its current state. The quiet strategies that are formed begin to interact with one another, amplifying their effects, creating new possibilities from their overlap. The system is no longer stable in the way it once was. It is ready. There is a strange calm in this moment. Not the empty stillness of the early world, but a deeper kind of quiet, one that exists just before something changes. The kind of quiet that carries weight, that suggests something is about to happen, even if it cannot yet be seen. If one could stand in this world, look across its oceans, and understand what lies beneath, they might feel it. That sense of anticipation. That feeling that the story has reached a point where it can no longer remain as it is. Because everything that has come before has been leading here. The slow rise of oxygen, the merging of cells, the formation of bodies, the emergence of movement, the beginning of interaction, the quiet birth of survival strategies. Each step, taken over unimaginable spans of time, has moved life closer to a threshold that now stands just ahead. And thresholds once reached are rarely stable places. They are points of transition, moments where what existed before can no longer continue in the same way, where change becomes not just possible, but inevitable. The silence that has defined this world for so long begins to feel fragile, as though it could break. Not slowly, not quietly, but all at once, because when change finally comes, after such a long period of preparation, it does not arrive gently. It arrives as release. A release of everything that has been building beneath the surface, everything that has been held back by conditions that no longer apply. And when that release happens, the world will not simply continue. It will transform in ways that no organism, no matter how complex, could have predicted. The long quiet age is ending, not with a fade, but with something far more sudden. And what comes next will redefine life on Earth forever. For most of Earth's history, change moves slowly enough to be almost invisible. A shift in chemistry here, a quiet adaptation there, each step unfolding across spans of time, so vast they seem to dissolve into stillness. The world had settled into that rhythm, a calm persistence where life grew, adapted, and endured without ever revealing its full potential. And then something breaks. Not with a sound, not with a single moment that can be clearly seen, but with a sudden acceleration that feels almost impossible after everything that came before. The oceans, once defined by simplicity and restraint, begin to fill with forms that have never existed before. Life surges. Shapes appear where there were none. Bodies that once remained simple begin to diversify, branching into countless variations, each one exploring a new possibility. Soft structures stretch into unfamiliar forms. Some flatten, others rise, others take on patterns and symmetries that hint at a deeper organization. It is not chaos, but it is no longer quiet. Across the ancient seas, life expresses itself in ways that feel almost sudden, almost overwhelming. Where there was once repetition, now there is variation. Where there was once limitation, now there is expansion. Organisms begin to occupy spaces differently, to take on roles that did not exist before, to interact in ways that are more dynamic, more complex. And yet this is not a true beginning. Nothing here has appeared from nothing. Every structure, every function, every possibility that now unfolds has been building quietly beneath the surface for billions of years. The merging of cells, the rise of oxygen, the formation of bodies, the first movements, the early interactions, all of it has been preparing for this moment. This is not creation. It is release. The barriers that once held life in place have weakened, and now the potential that's been waiting begins to unfold all at once. What was once constrained is now free to expand, to explore, to become something more. The pace changes. Time, which once seemed to stretch endlessly between small steps, now feels compressed. New forms appear more rapidly. That once took immense spans to emerge now arise in shorter sequences, each building upon the last, creating a besaid of change that transforms the oceans into something entirely new. The world is no longer defined by silence. It is defined by possibility. If one could observe this moment from within, it would not feel like a single event, but like a series of overlapping transformations, each one connected, each one contributing to a growing complexity that spreads across the seas. Life no longer hides within simplicity. It reveals itself, not loudly, but moissonnably. There are forms that resemble early animals, though they do not yet match anything familiar. Some move with greater control, their bodies shaped in ways that allow direction and purpose. Others remain anchored, but with structures that are more defined, more intricate, more capable of interacting with the environment around them. The ocean floor, once quiet and uniform, begins to feel populated, alive in a way it has never been before. And with this expansion comes a shift in perception. The world that once seemed empty, once felt silent and still, now reveals what it's been building toward all along. The long preparation, the endless patience, the quiet accumulation of change, none of it was without purpose. It was leading here, to a moment where life no longer remains hidden, where it begins to take form in ways that can be seen, imagined, understood. But even now, there is something deeper beneath this transformation, because what appears sudden is only the surface of a much longer story. The true change is not just in what has appeared, but in what has been made possible. A world that can now support complexity, interaction, and diversity on a scale that was once unimaginable. And as this new world begins to take shape, filled with forms that stretch across the oceans, a new question begins to emerge. Not about how life began, but about what it has become. Because now, for the first time, the answer is no longer hidden. It is everywhere. And yet still unfamiliar, waiting to be understood. The oceans no longer feel empty. Where once there were only faint shapes and slow, indistinct forms, there is now a growing presence of bodies that seem almost unfamiliar, even unsettling in their variety. Life has not only expanded, it has taken on forms that the world has never held before. They appear quietly at first, soft shapes resting along the seafloor, patterned in ways that suggest order rather than randomness. Some spread outward like delicate impressions pressed into the sediment, their bodies divided into repeating sections that mirror themselves with strange precision. Others rise slightly above the surface, forming structures that feel both fragile and deliberate, as if shaped by a design that has only just begun to understand itself. There are forms that carry coverings, thin outer layers that offer protection, creating a boundary between what is inside and what lies beyond. These coverings are not yet hard in the way later shells will become, but they hint at a new direction, a growing need to endure a world that is becoming less predictable. Movement becomes more defined. What was once a slow drift or gentle shift now begins to take on purpose. Some of these early creatures glide across surfaces, leaving faint traces behind them. Others contract and extend their bodies in repeated patterns, pushing themselves forward through the water or along the ocean floor. It is not fast, not efficient, but it is controlled, directed. And with that direction comes something new. Interaction becomes more immediate. Organisms no longer simply encounter one another by chance. They begin to move toward, around, and sometimes into one another's space with increasing frequency. Some brush against surfaces as they travel, exploring their environment in ways that were not possible before. Others cluster in certain areas drawn by conditions that support their EE, and among them, a few begin to do something even more significant. They begin to take, not in the quiet, passive way of earlier interactions, but with a growing sense of function. One organism encounters another, and rather than simply existing beside it, begins to consume it more deliberately. It is not yet the clear act of hunting, not a pursuit driven by speed or awareness, but it carries the same outcome. Energy is taken directly from another living form. The implications ripple outward, because now the shapes that fill the ocean are not just varied, they are connected through relationships that shape how they exist. A form that moves in one way influences another that must respond. A body that protects itself forces others to adapt. A creature that consumes becomes part of a cycle that did not exist before. The world begins to feel layered, complex, alive in a way that is no longer subtle, and yet there is something deeply unfamiliar about it all. These creatures do not resemble anything that would be easily recognized. Their forms are strange, their movements unusual, their structures unlike the animals that will one day walk the land or swim through modern seas. They exist in a world that feels distant, almost alien, shaped by conditions and possibilities that no longer exist in quite the same way. But that distance is only an illusion. Because within these unfamiliar forms lies something deeply connected to everything that will come after. The segmented patterns, the early limbs, the protective layers, the directed movement, all of these are the first expressions of systems that will continue to evolve, to refine, to transform into the diversity of life that will one day fill the planet. They are not separate from what follows. They are the beginning of it. Every complex organism, every animal that will ever exist, traces its origin back through these early forms, through these quiet experiments in structure and function that now unfold across the ancient seas. The world has changed, not just in appearance, but in meaning. Life is no longer hidden, it is present, expanding into forms that carry the future within them. And as these creatures continue to emerge, to move, to interact, something else begins to take shape within this growing complexity. A dynamic that will not simply add to life, but will begin to transform it entirely. The change does not arrive as violence, at least not in the way it will later be understood. There are no sudden chases across vast distances, no dramatic struggles that disrupt the calm of the oceans. The movements remain slow, the water still carries its quiet rhythm, and yet, beneath that surface, something fundamental begins to shift in the way life exists. For the first time, some organisms begin to seek others. Not by accident, not through passive contact, but through a growing ability to detect and respond with direction. Signals that once guided movement toward light or nutrients now begin to guide movement towards something else. Another living form. At first it is uncertain. An organism drifts closer, drawn by faint feculusis, by subtle differences in its surroundings. It moves not with speed but with persistence, adjusting its position until it reaches what it has sensed. And then, instead of passing by, it engages. The encounter changes. What was once a simple contact becomes an interaction with consequence. One organism begins to break down another, to absorb it, to use it as a direct source of energy. It is not yet a chase in the modern sense, but it is no longer passive. It is intentional in its effect. And that is enough. Because this is the moment where the balance of life shifts from coexistence to conflict. Not constant, not overwhelming, but present in a way it has never been before. The oceans, once defined by quiet interaction, now carry an undercurrent of tension. Life is no longer only something that survives. It becomes something that can be taken. This introduces a new kind of pressure, one that spreads quickly through the living world. An organism that can consume others gains a powerful advantage. It no longer depends solely on its environment for energy. It can draw directly from other forms of life, from the structures and processes that already exist, and in response, those other forms begin to change. Some develop thicker outer layers, making them harder to break down. Others alter their shape, becoming less accessible, less predictable. Some begin to move more effectively, not just to seek, but to avoid. The pace of change begins to increase. Not suddenly, not all at once, but noticeably. Adaptations that once took vast spans of time begin to appear more frequently, each one a response to the growing presence of predation. Life is no longer evolving in isolation or even simple interaction. It is evolving in reaction. This is the beginning of a feedback system. A change in one organism creates pressure on another, which in turn creates new conditions that influence the first. Each step leads to another, forming a cycle that drives complexity forward in ways that were not possible before. The world becomes more dynamic, not chaotic, but active in a deeper sense. Every organism now exists within a network of pressures that shape how it must survive. The calm persistence of earlier ages gives way to something more uncertain, more demanding. There is risk, and with risk comes opportunity. The ability to hunt allows for new forms of life to emerge, forms that can specialize, that can refine their movements, their structures, their interactions. At the same time, the need to avoid being hunted pushes others to develop their own strategies, their own adaptations. The result is a world that is no longer stable in the way it once was. It is changing continuously as each organism responds to the presence of others. And though the movements are still slow, the interaction is still simple, the direction is unmistakable. Life is accelerating, not because time has changed, but because the forces acting upon it have become stronger, more immediate, more connected. The quiet balance that once defined the planet has been replaced by something else. A system of pressure and response, of action and reaction, of survival that must now be earned in ways that were never required before. And once this system begins, it does not stop. It deepens, expands, and drives life toward greater complexity with every passing age. Because in a world where life hunts life, standing still is no longer enough. And as this new dynamic takes hold, the path forward becomes clear. Life is entering a phase where change is constant, where adaptation is continuous, and where the possibilities of what it can become begin to expand beyond anything that has existed before. At some point, the changes stop feeling separate. No longer does one organism exist without influencing another. No longer does a single adaptation remain isolated, contained within one form of life. Everything begins to connect quietly at first, then with increasing clarity, until the entire living world feels woven together in ways that were once impossible. The oceans are no longer just filled with life. They are structured by it. What was once a collection of individual organisms, each surviving on its own, becomes something more organized, more interdependent. Relationships that began as simple interactions now form patterns, repeating across different environments, linking one form of life to another in ways that create balance. Not a still balance, a living one. Some organisms draw energy directly from their surroundings, capturing light or chemical sources and transforming them into something usable. They do not move far, often remaining anchored or drifting slowly, but they form the foundation of everything that follows. Others depend on them. They consume what has been produced, drawing energy from these primary sources, converting it again, passing it forward through the system. And then there are those that break down what remains, returning it to the environment, allowing the cycle to begin again. Nothing is wasted. Everything is used. The flow of energy, once simple and direct, becomes layered, moving through multiple forms of life before returning to its origin. Each organism plays a role, even if it is not aware of it, even if it cannot perceive the system it is part of. Together they form something new, an ecosystem. It does not announce itself. There is no single moment where it begins. But as these connections deepen, as the relationships between organisms grow more consistent, the structure becomes undeniable. The ocean is no longer just a place where life exists. It is a system that sustains itself, and within that system, stability begins to emerge, not from stillness, but from complexity. This is the unexpected shift. For so long, stability meant simplicity. A world that changed slowly, where life remained small and uniform, where nothing disrupted the quiet persistence of existence. But now, stability comes from something else entirely, from interaction, from connection, from the constant exchange between organisms that keeps the system balanced even as it remains active. If one part changes, another responds. If one form declines, another adapts. The system does not collapse easily because it is supported by many parts, each contributing to the whole. The world begins to feel different, not just alive but responsive in a deeper way. Movement, interaction, consumption, and renewal all occur continuously, shaping the environment and being shaped by it in return. The oceans, once silent and still, now carry an underlying rhythm, a flow of activity that never truly stops. And yet, this complexity does not create chaos. It creates order, a dynamic order, constantly shifting, but never entirely lost, where each organism exists within a network that supports its survival, while also depending on it. Life is no longer separate from its environment. It is part of it, and this realization changes everything, because once life becomes interconnected, its potential expands. New roles can emerge, new strategies can develop, new forms can take shape, each one fitting into the system in a way that allows it to persist. The possibilities multiply. The world once defined by limitation now begins to open. And as these ecosystems stabilize, holding together through countless interactions, another shift begins to take place within them. Organisms no longer exist simply as part of the system. They begin to adapt to specific roles within it. Not randomly, not without direction, but in ways that refine their place, that shape their form and function to fit the growing complexity around them. Because in a connected world, survival is no longer just about existing, it is about belonging. And with that comes the next transformation, one that will shape life into forms that are more defined, more specialized, and more deeply tied to the roles they begin to fulfill. The connections deepen, and with them, something begins to separate. Life, once defined by shared patterns and similar forms, starts to divide into differences that matter, not just in size or shape, but in purpose and purpose. Organisms no longer exist as variations of the same idea. They begin to become something specific. The shift is gradual, almost quiet in its beginning. Within the growing networks of life, certain forms begin to adapt more closely to the roles they occupy. Those that move refine their ability to do so, developing structures that allow more control, more direction. What was once a simple contraction becomes something more defined, a repeated motion shaped by the needs of survival. Other organisms begin to sense more effectively. Subtle responses to light or chemicals grow more refined, more consistent, allowing them to react with greater precision. The world becomes clearer to them, not in a conscious way, but in a functional one. Signals that were once faint begin to guide behavior more reliably. And then there are those that remain still, but not unchanged. They develop structures that allow them to hold their position more effectively, to capture energy or resources with greater efficiency. Their bodies become shaped by their environment, formed in ways that reflect the role they play within the system. The differences begin to grow, not randomly, but with direction. Some organisms become better at movement, others become better at feeding. Some develop ways to protect themselves, while others become more effective at overcoming those protections. Each form begins to align more closely with a particular way of surviving, and with that alignment, the diversity of life expands. The oceans, once filled with forms that seemed similar in their simplicity, now hold a growing variety of structures. Bodies take on new shapes, some elongated, others compact, some segmented, others smooth. Each variation carries with it a purpose, even if that purpose is not yet realized, is not just an increase in number. It is an increase in function. The living world begins to organize itself into roles, each organism contributing to the system in a different way. Some produce, some consume, some break down and return what remains. Within these broad patterns, more specific roles begin to form, creating layers of complexity that did not exist before. And yet this growing specialization brings with it a new kind of balance, a system where each part depends more deeply on the others. At first, this makes the world more efficient. Energy flows more smoothly, resources are used more completely, and the interactions between organisms become more structured. The system stabilizes, supported by the diversity within it, but there is something else beneath that stability. A quiet fragility, because as organisms become more specialized, they also become more dependent on the conditions that support their role. A form that is highly adapted to one way of life may struggle if those conditions change. A system built on interconnected roles becomes sensitive to disruption, as each part relies on the presence of others. The balance becomes more complex, more resilient in some ways, but also more delicate in others. This is the trade that life begins to make. In gaining complexity, it also accepts uncertainty. The oceans continue to feel alive, filled with forms that now carry distinct identities, each one shaped by the path it has taken. And though these forms remain unfamiliar, there are hints of something recognizable within them. Early outlines of movement, of structure, of interaction that will one day become more defined. The beginnings of roles that will persist far beyond this moment. Life is no longer just connected, it is organized. And as this organization deepens, as specialization continues to shape the living world, something else begins to happen. The boundaries that once confined life begin to feel less fixed. The oceans, though vast, are no longer the only place where possibility exists. Because once life has learned to adapt so precisely, to take on forms suited to specific conditions, it becomes capable of something new. It begins to explore beyond what it has always known. The oceans are no longer enough for a long time. They were everything. Every movement, every interaction, every adaptation unfolded within their vast shifting depths. Life expanded, diversified, and learned to exist in countless ways, all contained within the same endless body of water. It seemed complete, as though nothing beyond it was needed, but now something begins to change, not in the form of a sudden departure, not yet, but in the quiet expansion of possibility. Life, shaped by the pressures and opportunities within the oceans, begins to move into spaces it has not fully explored before. Areas that were once too deep, too unstable, or too unfamiliar begin to fill with new forms. The boundaries soften along the ocean floor. Environments grow more varied. Some regions sink into darkness where light no longer reaches, and yet life finds ways to persist. Other areas rise and fall with shifting sediments, creating surfaces that change over time, forcing organisms to adapt to conditions that are never entirely stable. Each new space introduces a challenge, and with that challenge, a response. Organisms begin to adjust, not just to survive, but to fit into these new conditions. Some develop structures that allow them to anchor more firmly, holding their place against shifting currents, or unstable ground. Others refine their movement, becoming better at navigating uneven surfaces or drifting through deeper waters where the environment feels entirely different. The variety of life continues to grow not only in form, but in location. It spreads across different depths, across changing landscapes beneath the ocean, across environments that were once empty or too difficult to sustain. The world within the water becomes layered, each layer holding its own patterns, its own forms, its own interactions. And with this expansion comes something new, a sense of direction. Not a conscious intent, not a deliberate movement toward a goal, but a gradual reaching outward. Life no longer remains confined to the spaces where it first began. It begins to occupy what is available, to extend into areas that were once beyond its limits. The same forces that shaped its growth within the oceans now guide it further. Adaptation, interaction, specialization. Each one pushing life to explore, to test, to move into environments that require new ways of existing. What worked in one place is adjusted in another. What succeeded under one condition is reshaped to meet a different one. The process is continuous, quiet but persistent, And yet, even as life spreads through the oceans, filling them with increasing complexity, there remains a boundary it has not yet crossed. The edge of the water, beyond it lies always a world that has remained silent for as long as life has existed. A surface shaped by wind, by temperature, by forces that differ from those beneath the waves. A place that holds potential, but also risk. For now, life does not move on to it, but it comes closer. Along the shallow edges where water meets land, conditions begin to shift more rapidly. These regions are unstable, changing with tides, with temperature, with exposure. They are neither fully ocean nor fully land, but something in between. And within these shifting spaces, life begins to adapt once again. Not yet to leave the water entirely, but to endure its absence for brief moments. To survive conditions that are different, harsher, less predictable than anything it has known before. These are small steps, almost unnoticeable in the vast timeline of the planet, but they matter. Because each adjustment, each quiet experiment moves life slightly closer to a possibility that has never been realized. A possibility that has been waiting unchanged since the earliest days of the Earth. The oceans are full, dynamic, alive in ways that once seemed impossible, but they are no longer the only stage where life might exist. And as these first steps continue, as life edges closer to environments that challenge everything it has become, the story begins to shift once more, toward a new world, one that lies just beyond the surface. If one could look across the surface of the Earth now, and then look back to what it once was, there was a time when the world existed in near silence. Oceans stretched beneath a quiet sky, filled with life that could not be seen, could not be imagined, could not be understood in any familiar way. The land lay empty, untouched, waiting without knowing what it was waiting for. Everything existed, and yet almost nothing revealed itself. That world is gone, not erased, not replaced entirely, but transformed so completely that it can no longer be recognized in the same way. The oceans are no longer silent expanses, hiding invisible processes. They are filled with movement, with form, with interactions that unfold continuously. Life does not remain hidden anymore. It exists openly, shaping the world as much as it is shaped by it. The stillness has been broken. Where once there was only persistence, there is now activity. Organisms move through the water with purpose, respond to one another, consume, and are consumed, adapt and change. The quiet patterns of earlier ages have given way to something far more dynamic, a system that evolves not slowly and invisibly, but through constant interaction. The contrast is profound. Simplicity has given way to complexity. Uniformity has been replaced by diversity. What was once a world defined by limitation has become a world defined by possibility. Every part of the ocean now carries layers of life, each one connected to the others, each one contributing to a network that did not exist before. And yet, despite all of this change, something remains the same. The foundation is still there, beneath the movement, beneath the complexity. The quiet processes that once defined the planet continue to exist. Microbial life still persists, still shapes the chemistry of the oceans, still plays a role in maintaining the balance that allows everything else to continue. The silent world has not disappeared, it has been built upon. Layer by layer, the past remains within the present, hidden but essential. This is what makes the transformation so remarkable. It is not a replacement, but an expansion. The world has not lost its original nature, it has grown beyond it. What was once enough is now only the beginning, and that realization carries a quiet weight. Because it reveals something deeper about the nature of life itself. That change does not erase what came before, it adds to it. The long silence, the slow rise of oxygen, the merging of cells, the first movements, the earliest interactions, all of it still exists within this new world, not as memory, but as structure. Every complex form carries the history of those earlier steps built into its very existence. The transformation is not just visible, it is continuous. And yet, even now, there is a sense that the story has not reached its full expression. The oceans are alive in ways that once seemed impossible, but they are still contained within their boundaries. The land, though no longer entirely untouched, remains largely silent, waiting in a way that feels familiar, echoing the quiet of the earliest world. There is a balance here, a moment where everything has changed and yet something more is still to come. The world feels complete, but it is not finished, because stability, once reached, does not remain unchanged forever. The systems that now sustain life continue to shift, to respond, to adapt. New pressures begin to form, subtle at first, but growing in ways that will once again push life beyond its current state. The transformation that has already taken place is immense, but it is not the final one. It is simply the next stage in a story that continues to unfold. And as the world settles into this new form, alive and interconnected, the conditions begin to change once more, quietly, patiently, preparing for another step that will carry life beyond everything it has known so far. Balance does not last. For a time, the world settles into its new rhythm. The oceans are filled with life that moves, interacts, and adapts within a system that feels stable, even complete. Energy flows through ecosystems in steady cycles. Organisms fit into roles that support one another, and the complexity that has emerged holds together in a way that seems almost permanent. But permanence is an illusion, because even as life finds its balance, the planet beneath it continues to change. The continents do not remain still. They drift slowly, shifting the shape of the oceans, altering coastlines, creating new shallow seas while closing others. What was once open becomes confined. What was once connected becomes separated. These movements are slow, almost imperceptible in a single moment, but over time they reshape the world in ways that life cannot ignore. Climates begin to shift as well. Temperatures rise and fall across vast stretches of time, influencing where life can thrive and where it must struggle to survive. Some regions become more stable, supporting growth and diversity. Others grow harsh, limiting what can exist within them. Ice may spread, then retreat. Warm waters may expand, then contract. Nothing remains fixed. Even within the oceans, conditions continue to evolve. Currents change direction, redistributing nutrients in new patterns. Areas that were once rich become less so, while others begin to support new forms of life. The balance that once felt steady begins to shift again, not collapsing, but adjusting. And with each adjustment, life must respond. This is the nature of evolution. It does not stop once complexity is achieved. It does not pause when ecosystems form or when balance is reached. Instead, it continues, driven by the constant changes of the world itself. Every shift in environment introduces new challenges, new pressures that force life to adapt once more. Some organisms thrive under these changes. They adjust, refine their structures, expand into new spaces that open as conditions shift. Others struggle, unable to adapt quickly enough, fading as the world moves beyond them. The system remains active, constantly reshaping itself in response to forces that never truly settle. This creates a new kind of tension. Not the tension of conflict between organisms, but the tension between life and the planet it inhabits. A dynamic relationship where neither remains static, where each influences the other in ways that drive continuous change. The world begins to feel less predictable, less contained. What was once a stable environment now carries a sense of movement, not just within life, but within the planet itself. The ground shifts, the water changes, the air evolves, and life must keep pace or be left behind. And yet, within this constant change lies something important. Opportunity. Every challenge creates a new possibility. A shifting coastline opens new habitations. A changing climate creates conditions that did not exist before. Variations in nutrient flow allow new forms to emerge, to explore roles that were previously unavailable. Life does not simply endure these changes. It uses them, it expands into them, finding ways to adapt, to survive, to grow within conditions that are always moving forward. The complexity that has formed does not collapse under pressure. It evolves with it, becoming more intricate, more responsive, more capable of existing within a world that never stands still. This is the deeper pattern that begins to reveal itself. Stability is not the goal. Change is. Every stage of life's development, from the earliest silence to the present complexity, has been shaped by shifts in the environment. Each transformation has come not from stillness but from movement, from pressures. that force life to become something more. And now, once again, those pressures begin to point in a new direction. The oceans, though vast and dynamic, are no longer the only environment where life might exist. The changes unfolding across the planet begin to create conditions that extend beyond the water, opening possibilities that were once impossible. The boundary between ocean and land begins to matter, more than it ever has before, because as pressures continue to build, as the world shifts in ways that life must respond to, the next step becomes clear, not as a sudden leap, but as a gradual movement towards something new, a frontier that has remained untouched for billions of years, waiting just beyond the surface. And as life continues to adapt, to respond, to evolve within the changing world, it is slowly, quietly being pushed toward that boundary, toward a place it has never fully entered, but soon will, beyond the movement of the oceans, beyond the shifting currents, and the growing complexity beneath the water. There is another world. It has always been there, unchanged in ways that feel almost familiar, as though it still carries the memory of an earlier time. The continents stretch beneath the sky, shaped by wind, by temperature, by forces that differ from those within the sea. Their surfaces rise and fall, carved slowly by elements that do not support life in the same way water does. For billions of years they have remained empty, not entirely lifeless perhaps, but untouched by the kind of complexity that now fills the oceans. No movement crosses their surfaces, no visible forms rise or spread. They exist as a quiet contrast to the living world beneath the waves. And yet that contrast is beginning to change, not dramatically, not all at once, but in ways that suggest something is approaching. Along the edges where ocean meets land, the environment becomes less certain. Water recedes and returns. Surfaces are exposed, then covered again. Conditions shift more rapidly here than in the deeper, more stable parts of the sea. It is a place of transition, of instability, where life is pushed beyond the conditions it has grown accustomed to. And within these shifting boundaries, life begins to reach. Not with intention, not with awareness, but through adaptation. Some organisms find themselves exposed, if only for brief moments, to conditions outside the water. They endure dryness, changes in temperature, variations that would have once been impossible to survive. Most do not last long in these moments. The environment is harsh, unpredictable, lacking the support that water provides. But a few persist. They adjust, in small ways, subtle changes that allow them to survive just a little longer outside their familiar world. A slight resistance to drying. A structure that holds together under new conditions, a way of existing that does not immediately fail when the water recedes. These are not yet the forms that will one day live fully on land. They are only hints, early responses to a boundary that has not yet been crossed. The oceans continue to hold the vast majority of life, still dynamic, still evolving, still filled with movement and interaction. Nothing has left them in any permanent sense. The land remains, for the most part, quiet and empty. But something has begun a connection, a reaching outward. It is almost impossible to see in a single moment. There is no clear event, no visible transition that marks the beginning of this change, only a gradual shift where life begins to exist at the edge of what it has always known. And edges have a way of drawing things forward. Because once life can survive at the boundary, even briefly, the possibility of moving beyond it begins to form, not as a certainty, not as a plan, but as something that can happen, something that might happen. The silence of the land, so long untouched, begins to feel different. Not empty, but waiting. Waiting in the same way the oceans once did, before life filled them with movement and form. Waiting for the conditions that will allow something new to take hold, to spread, to transform what has remained changed for so long. And as this realization settles, a quiet sense of anticipation begins to build, because the next step will not simply expand life, it will redefine it. The transition that lies ahead is not just a movement from one environment to another, it is a shift into a world that demands entirely new ways of existing, new structures, new strategies, new forms that have never been required before. And yet the process has already begun quietly, almost invisibly. Life is no longer confined to the oceans in the way it once was. It has reached the edge. And once something reaches the edge, it rarely turns back, because beyond the oceans lies a world that has never known life as it will soon become. A world that is about to change. And when that change begins, it will carry life into a future that could not have been imagined in the silence that came before. The view shifts. For so long, the story has remained within the oceans, following the rise of life as it moved, changed, and grew more complex beneath the surface. But now, attention turns elsewhere, away from the depths, away from the movement, towards something that has remained almost unchanged, the land. It stretches across the planet in vast open forms, shaped by forces that have acted upon it for ages. Wind moves across its surface, carving patterns into rock. Rain falls, gathering into streams that cut slow paths through the terrain. Rivers form, winding through empty spaces, shaping valleys and carrying sediments toward the sea. Everything is in motion. And yet, nothing is alive in the way the oceans have become. There are no visible organisms moving across this landscape. No forms rising from the ground, no signs of interaction, no indication that this world holds the same complexity that now fills the waters. The continents exist in a kind of quiet isolation, separate from the dynamic systems below. It feels untouched, as though it belongs to him. The contrast is striking. Beneath the oceans, life has expanded into countless forms, interacting and adapting, shaping its environment in ways that are continuous. But here, on land, that activity does not yet exist. The surface remains still, open, and waiting. It is easy to see it as empty, but that emptiness is not complete. Because even here, in this quiet world, life has already begun to leave its mark, though in ways that are almost impossible to see. Thin films of microscopic organisms cling to damp surfaces, existing in small pockets where conditions allow them to persist, in shallow areas where water lingers in cracks within rock, in the earliest layers of forming soil. Life is present, not visible, not dominant, but there. These organisms do not move across the land, do not transform it in dramatic ways. They exist quietly, just as life once did in the oceans, shaping their surroundings in small gradual processes. They break down minerals, contribute to the formation of soil, alter the chemistry of the surfaces they inhabit. The same silent work that once prepared the oceans is beginning here as well, slowly, patiently. The land is not lifeless, it is unoccupied. A place where life has not yet fully arrived, but where the conditions for its arrival are beginning to take shape. The foundation is forming, just as it did before, in a way that mirrors the earliest stages of life's history beneath the water. And this creates a sense that is difficult to ignore, not absence but anticipation, because this world, though quiet, holds potential. The rivers continue to flow, carving paths that could one day support movement. The surfaces shift and change, creating environments that could be inhabited. The atmosphere above interacts with the land in ways that could sustain something more. Everything is in place, but nothing has yet taken hold. The silence feels familiar, echoing the earliest ages of the planet, before life filled the oceans with complexity. And just as it did then, this silence now carries the same quiet question. What will come next? Because the land, in all its stillness, is not separate from the story. It is the next stage of it. And as this realization settles, something begins to shift once more, not on the land itself, but in the oceans that surround it. Life, already dynamic and widespread, begins to press against the boundaries it has always known. Organisms move closer to the edges, to the places where water meets land, where conditions are less stable, more demanding, closer than ever before. Because the land may be waiting, but life is beginning to move toward it. The boundary is not a line, it is a place, a shifting, uncertain space where the ocean meets the land, where conditions change from moment to moment, never fully one thing or the other. Here, the water does not remain constant. It rises and falls, moves forward and retreats, exposing surfaces that are sometimes submerged, sometimes left open to the air. It is an unstable world, and it is here that life begins to change again. At first, it does not arrive with intention. Organisms that have long existed within the oceans find themselves carried into these shallow zones by currents, by movement, by the slow expansion of their own presence. They do not seek the boundary, they encounter it. And when they do, the conditions are unlike anything they have known before. Water that once surrounded them completely now disappears, if only for a short time. Surfaces that were always submerged become exposed. The temperature shifts more rapidly. The environment becomes less predictable, more demanding, less forgiving. Most do not endure it. For many forms of life, these conditions are too extreme. Without the constant support of water, they cannot maintain their structure, cannot survive the exposure, cannot continue as they have before. They return to the ocean or disappear entirely, unable to exist in this in-between space. But not all, some persist. Not easily, not without strain, but just enough to continue. They endure the brief absence of water, holding together long enough for it to return. They tolerate changes in temperature that would have once been impossible. They adapt in small ways, subtle adjustments that allow them to survive, just a little longer at the edge. These are not dramatic transformations. There are no new forms, rising. From thee, no clear trend from water surface. Only small changes repeated again and again across countless generations, each one slightly more capable of enduring the instability of this bouleke. It becomes a testing ground, a place where survival is uncertain, where the conditions themselves act as a force, pushing life beyond what it has been. There is no choice in this process, no decision to explore new territory. Life is not moving forward by intention, it is being pushed. Driven by changes in the environment, by the shifting of coastlines, by the fluctuations of water and climate that bring organisms into contact with conditions they cannot avoid. The boundary is no longer just a limit, it becomes a pressure, and under that pressure something begins to change. The separation between ocean and land starts to feel less absolute. The edge, once a barrier that defined where life could and could not exist, begins to act as a bridge, a place where new possibilities form, not because they are sought out, but because they are required. Life adapts because it must, because the world no longer allows it to remain unchanged. The organisms that endure these conditions do not yet belong to the land. They remain tied to the water, dependent on its return, unable to survive without it for long. But they carry something new within them, the ability to exist even briefly beyond the ocean. And that ability, however limited, begins to matter. Each moment of survival outside the water, each small adjustment that allows an organism to endure the boundary, builds upon the last. The process is slow, almost invisible, unfolding across spans of time that stretch far beyond immediate observation. But it continues, relentless in its quiet persistence. The edge is no longer just a place where life ends. It is a place where something new begins. And as these fragile experiments repeat, as life continues to encounter this boundary and adapt to its demands, a shift begins to take shape, one that will not remain confined to this narrow space between two worlds. Because eventually one step will go further, one form will endure longer, one moment will extend beyond all the others that came before it. And when that happens, the boundary will no longer hold. It will be crossed. The moment does not announce itself. There is no clear beginning. No sudden arrival that marks the instant when life leaves the ocean behind. The tides continue their steady rhythm, water rising and falling against the edges of the land, exposing and covering the same shifting surfaces as they always have. Everything appears unchanged, and yet something is different within those boundary spaces. Among the organisms that have learned to endure the instability between water and air, a small shift takes place. One form remains outside the ocean just a little longer than before. Not by much, not enough to be noticed in a single moment, but enough to matter. It does not return immediately. It persists. The conditions are still harsh. The surface is dry, the air unfamiliar, the support of water absent. But this organism holds together, maintaining its structure, continuing its quiet processes, even without the environment it has always depended on. It survives, and in that survival, something new begins. This is not a leap from one world to another. There is no sudden transformation into a form fully suited for life on land. These early pioneers remain simple, fragile, limited in what they can endure. They cannot travel far. They cannot exist for long without moisture. They remain tied to the edge, dependent on conditions that still resemble the ocean. But they are there, on the land. For the first time, life exists beyond the water, not as a brief accident, but as a sustained presence. It is small, almost invisible, easily overlooked against the vastness of the continents. And yet it changes the nature of the world entirely. Because the land is no longer silent. It has been touched. This change spreads slowly. Other organisms begin to follow, not in a wave, not in a coordinated movement, but in scattered attempts, each one shaped by the same pressures that brought the first. Some succeed, enduring just long enough to leave their mark. Others fail, unable to survive the unfamiliar conditions. The process is uneven, fragile, but it continues. Thin layers of life begin to form along damp surfaces, in places where water lingers or returns often enough to support them. These forms do not yet reshape the landscape in visible ways, but they begin to alter it in small, gradual processes. They interact with the surface, with minerals, with the early formations of soil, contributing to changes that will only become clear much later. The land, once defined by absence, now holds presence. It is quiet still, but it is no longer empty. The significance of this moment is easy to miss. There is no dramatic shift in the appearance of the planet, no sudden expansion of life across the continents. The oceans remain the center of complexity, the primary space where life thrives and evolves. But something has changed that cannot be reversed. Life has crossed the boundary, and once crossed, that boundary will never be the same again. The edge that once separated two worlds now connects them. What was once a limit has become a path, however narrow, however difficult. And over time, that path will widen, shaped by the same forces that have guided every transformation before. Adaptation, interaction, pressure, each one continuing to act upon life, pushing it further, shaping it into forms that can endure more, move further, exist in ways that are not yet possible. For now, the presence of life on land remains small, almost hidden, but it carries within it the weight of everything that's come before and the potential for everything that will follow. Because this is not just an expansion. It is a beginning, a quiet, fragile beginning that will grow slowly and steadily into something far beyond what the world has ever known. And as life takes hold on land, even in its simplest forms, the story moves forward once again, toward a world where the continents themselves will become alive. It is easy to think of the past as something that has been left behind, a distant sequence of events unfolding and then fading, replaced by what comes after. The silent oceans, the long ages of simplicity, the invisible life that once defined the planet, these feel like chapters that have ended, closed by the arrival of something more complex, more visible, more alive. But that is not what happened. The quiet world did not disappear. It remains beneath every movement, beneath every interaction, beneath every form that now fills the oceans and stretches across the land. The same processes continue. The same microscopic life that once dominated the planet still exists, still thrives, still shapes the conditions that allow everything else to persist. It has never left. It was never replaced. It was layered over, within the soil, within the water, within the air itself. Countless unseen organisms continue their work, just as they did billions of years ago. They move through environments too small to notice, carrying out processes that remain essential, transforming materials, sustaining cycles that larger forms of life depend upon without ever recognizing. The world still runs on silence. Even now, every ecosystem, no matter how complex, rests upon these hidden foundations. The vast networks of life that appear so dynamic, so interconnected, are supported by systems that operate quietly, without attention, without interruption. The same patterns that once defined the entire planet now exist within every part of it. Nothing has truly been lost. Only expanded. This is the deeper continuity of life. The past is not separate from the present. It exists within it, embedded in ways that cannot be removed, Every organism carries traces of those earliest forms, not just in structure, but in function. The way energy is used, the way cells by cells operate, the way life sustains itself, all of it reaches back to that quiet beginning. The silence is still here, hidden but constant, and in that realization, the story begins to shift. Because what once seemed like an empty world, a long period of waiting before life truly began, now reveals itself as something else entirely. It was not a delay, it was not a pause, it was a foundation built slowly and carefully, creating the conditions that made everything else possible. Without it, nothing that followed could exist. The movement, the complexity, the diversity, all of it depends on that earlier world, that quiet where life learned how to be. And even now, that lesson continues. In every place where life thrives, the same balance must be maintained. The visible depends on the invisible. The active depends on the still. The complex depends on the simple in ways that are easy to overlook, but impossible to remove. The world has changed beyond recognition, but at its core, it remains the same. This creates a different kind of understanding, one that does not separate the past from the present, but sees them as part of a continuous whole. The long silence of early Earth is not something that ended. It is something that continues, woven into every layer of life that has formed since. It is still happening even now, and as this realization settles, the story moves beyond what has happened to what it means. Because this journey from silence to complexity, from invisibility to form, is not just a sequence of events. It is a pattern, one that reveals something deeper about the nature of life itself, a pattern that continues to unfold long after its beginning has passed. And in that unfolding, there is something still to understand. It is tempting to see the story of life as something inevitable, a steady progression from simplicity to complexity, from silence to movement, from invisible beginnings to a world filled with forms that seem almost destined to appear. Looking back, it can feel as though each step led naturally to the next, as if the outcome was always waiting, certain from the very beginning. But the deeper one looks, the less certain it becomes. Because nothing about this path was guaranteed. Every stage depended on conditions so precise, so delicately balanced, that even a small difference could have changed everything. The rise of oxygen, so gradual and quiet, required the persistence of microscopic life over immense spans of time. Too little, and complexity could not be sustained at Arsenke. Too much, too quickly, and life itself might have collapsed under the change. The timing had to be right. The environment had to remain stable just long enough for new forms to emerge, yet dynamic enough to push them forward. Continents had to shift in ways that created opportunity without causing irreversible disruption. Oceans had to circulate nutrients in patterns that supported growth without limiting it. Each element mattered, and none existed in isolation. The merging of cells, the formation of complex structures, the emergence of movement and interaction, all of these depended on what came before, each step building upon conditions that could not be recreated easily if lost. A single failure, a single imbalance could have halted the process, leaving life in a state of simplicity that might have persisted indefinitely. The long quiet age was not just a beginning, it was a threshold that could have remained broken. Even the emergence of early ecosystems, the rise of predation, the expansion into new environments, all of these required a chain of circumstances that aligned in ways that seem almost improbable when viewed together. The more complex life became, the more conditions it depended upon, the more fragile its path forward. It did not advance because it had to, it advanced because it could. And that distinction changes everything, because it reveals that the world as it exists now is not the only outcome that was possible. It is one outcome among many that might have been shaped by countless moments where the direction of life could have shifted, slowed, or stopped entirely. There could have been a world where the oceans remained filled only with simple forms, where the silence of early Earth continued without interruption. A world where complexity never emerged, where no movement crossed the land, where no organism developed the structures that would one day lead to awareness, to thought, to the ability to look back and ask how it all began. That world was possible. And yet it did not happen. Instead, through a sequence of fragile steps, through changes that aligned just enough, life moved forward. It crossed thresholds that could have held it in place. It adapted to pressures that could have ended it. It built upon foundations that might never have formed, and from that complexity emerged, not as a certainty, but as a rare result. This realization carries a quiet weight, because it places everything that exists within a different perspective. Every organism, every ecosystem, every form of life that now fills the planet is part of that unlikely chain. Each one exists because countless conditions aligned, because countless moments unfolded in ways that allowed the story to continue. It is easy to overlook, to see the present as stable, as expected, but beneath that stability lies a history that was never secure, a path that could have turned in another direction at any point along the way, and even now, that fragility remains. The systems that support life continue to depend on balance, on conditions that must be maintained, on processes that, if disrupted, could shift the world once again. The story has not reached a point where change no longer matters. It never will, because life does not move towards certainty. It moves through possibility. And as this becomes clear, as the fragile nature of this journey settles into view, the story begins to draw toward its final reflection, not about what has happened, but about what it means. And what the long silence, the slow rise, the unlikely emergence of complexity can still teach about what lies ahead. The story does not arrive at an ending. It slows, it softens, it settles into a moment that feels complete, and yet it continues beyond that moment, carrying everything that has come before into what follows. The long silence, the slow rise of life, the emergence of complexity, none of these are separate chapters that have closed. They are part of a single movement that has never truly stopped. The earth still turns. It moves through space with the same quiet rhythm it has always held, rotating beneath a sky that has changed countless times, yet remains part of the same continuous system. Oceans still shift and flow, carrying energy across the planet, shaping conditions in ways both visible and unseen. The land, once silent, now holds life in forms that could not have been imagined in the earliest ages. And still, nothing stands still. Life continues to change. Not in sudden leaps, not in dramatic transformations that define a single moment, but in the same gradual way it always has. Small adaptations unfold across generations. Subtle shifts accumulate, shaping the direction of what will come next. The forces that guided the earliest forms of life, pressure, interaction, adaptation, remain active, still shaping the world as they always have. The story moves forward quietly, and yet there is a sense of calm within that movement, not because change has ended, but because it has found a rhythm. The same rhythm that once guided microscopic life in the ancient oceans now exists within every system, every ecosystem, every organism. It is not something new. It is something that has always been there, continuing without interruption. This is what the long silence reveals. It was never emptiness. It was never a pause before something more important began. It was the beginning itself, a foundation that still exists, still supports everything that has followed. The quiet world of early Earth was not separate from the present. It is part of it, woven into every layer of life that now fills the planet. The past has not been left behind. It remains, in the smallest structures of cells, in the processes that sustain life, in the balance that allows complexity to exist. The echoes of that early world continue. The silence, though no longer dominant, still underlies everything, shaping the way life persists even now. And this continuity extends forward as well. Because the story of life does not end with what exists today. It continues beyond it. The same forces that once guided life from simplicity to complexity still act upon the world, still creating conditions for change, still shaping possibilities that have not yet been realized. What exists now is not a final form, not a completed state, but a moment within an ongoing process. A moment that will pass just as all others have. There is something quiet in that realization, not unsettling, but grounding. A sense that life is part of something larger, something that does not begin or end within any single moment. The silence of the past, the movement of the present, and the changes yet to come all belong to the same continuous flow. Nothing is separate. Everything is connected, and as the story settles into this understanding, it does not close. It simply continues. The earth turns. The oceans move. Life adapts. And somewhere, in ways too small to notice, too gradual to see, the next change is already beginning. Just as it always has, just as it always will,